Hey kids, it's Chef Andrea here, and we have been deep diving into flour varietals, carbohydrate conversations, and now we are going to get into a little bit of a gluten conversation. Okay, carbohydrates got a bad rap in this country. A lot of people still on that bandwagon. Bread got a bad rap in this country. A lot of people still on that bandwagon. Gluten has gotten a bad rap in this country. So let's talk about it. I will start this video by reminding everyone who's watching that I am not a dietitian, I am not a nutritionist, and I am not a physician. I am a cook. If you are battling something health-wise, you need to speak to a physician, dietitian, or nutritionist. I will say that if you are battling something dietary-wise, I do definitely recommend that you seek out a GP or physician who advertises very clearly that they are well educated in nutrition and in diet. Medical school does not guarantee that. I'll let you do your own research on that, but the simple story is that nutrition and dietary classes are not a part of the curriculum to become an MD anymore. And there was a really interesting interview, I believe it's on Studio 1A on NPR. If you Googled on npr.org, Chicago School of Medicine, culinary medicine, it would come up. And you can hear exactly what I'm talking about. Let's talk about gluten intolerance for just a moment and celiacs. I'm just giving you some generals that you yourself can find by just doing some internet research or speaking to, again, a doctor or a dietitian, nutritionist. Celiacs. If you have celiacs, you absolutely cannot be exposed to gluten in any way. Gluten cannot transfer itself from one bag onto another. Gluten flitters down in your pantry from a type of cracker into a box of a gluten-free cracker, and you eat a bite of that, that little bit of transferred gluten will absolutely shut you down. It's not a joke. And if you do have celiacs, that is its own setup, and I don't have substitutions that I will guarantee will work. That's not where I go here. And you definitely want to seek out recipes and really seek out a professional who is devoted to that. I will say to you that if you have not been diagnosed with celiacs and you believe that that is something that could be a part of your life, that you need to get with someone and have that happen. But here's what I want to share based on sort of soft research. I have a lot of people that come through my doors, a lot of people who come through my doors and tell me that they do not eat gluten. Now, I don't eat gluten is different than I have celiacs. Those are two completely different statements. And I want to be crystal clear that a choice to not eat gluten is not the same thing as having a diagnosed autoimmune deficiency where if you do ingest gluten, you could potentially be hospitalized. It is a big deal to have celiacs. It is a much bigger deal than it is to just simply choose to use the words, I'm not eating gluten. Now, why I differentiate between the two. One, because they are completely different animals. One is a choice and one is an autoimmune deficiency. And not deficiency, I guess technically an autoimmune disease, right? It's devastating. And for those who do have it, I am sorry that that is something you're dealing with because it is very, very challenging to navigate. There is gluten in everything. It's a tricky one. But a lot of people come through my door telling me that they just don't eat gluten. And I often kind of scratch my head at that and wonder what is the impetus behind that? Where's that coming from? So one of the things that we talk about here in our bread baking classes is flour and flour varietals. And I've told you that I love King Arthur all-purpose unbleached flour. And that's what we do most of our breads with. And we also talk a little bit for a moment about gluten and its role in bread baking, more specifically, its role in creating texture in the breads that we are baking. Gluten is a really big, important part of that. So what I want to do is talk for a brief moment about gluten's role in flour and how that translates to the texture of our breads. And then I want to talk about the gluten-carb differential. So what is gluten? So here's one thing. We talked in the carbohydrate podcast about complex carbohydrates, which are carbohydrates that are balanced out by an equal portion of proteins. Complex carbohydrates are carbohydrates and proteins in equal portion. What's nice about a complex carbohydrate for our body is it's a perfect fuel source. We burn it incredibly efficiently in a long, slow, efficient burn. What's a drag about simple carbohydrates is that simple carbohydrates are missing the protein component. They're just carbohydrates or just very high carbohydrate ratio to protein ratio, and our bodies do not burn those efficiently and slowly. They burn them in a blazing fire, ring, and our insulin levels shoot through the roof, and then our glucose levels drop like a stone, and they're very, big energy, no energy. So we're always looking to try to balance those carbohydrates out with proteins and create complex carbohydrates. Often when people tell me that they do not eat gluten, I wonder sometimes if they are confused about what gluten is. And gluten is not a carbohydrate. So a lot of people in this country are off carbohydrates, which is its own problem, and we talk about that in another episode. But off gluten is confusing to me, because I do not know of very many, if any, elimination diets out there that tell you to eliminate proteins, right? So diets will tell you to stop all fat. That's garbage, by the way. Don't do that. Stop all fat. Diets will tell you to stop all carbohydrates. That's garbage, by the way. Don't do that. Stop all carbohydrates. Diets will tell you to stop all sugar. That's true, by the way. You can do that. I don't know that I have come across a diet that told you to go to no proteins. So if you haven't been assigned a low protein diet, why are you off gluten? Is it because we're confusing gluten with carbohydrates? Is it because we're feeling like gluten falls into the category of a carbohydrate? So let's talk about what gluten is in bread baking. Gluten is a protein that's found in wheat flour, in all wheat products, and it's found in some others too. There's a small trace amounts of gluten in rye flour. There's not as much as in wheat flour, but there is some there too. So we can find gluten in various things, but typically where we find our gluten is in our wheat flour. And if I were to take some flour and throw it onto a plate, like a glass plate, and put it under a microscope in a lab, and I mean, this is a big microscope, it's going to take me down to where I can look at the molecular structure of that ground wheat, okay? And I can see every individual molecule floating around in that ground wheat. I will be able to isolate visually some proteins that are floating around in there. And the proteins that I'll see are going to be glutens and elastins. And for the sake of this fake science with Chef Andrea, because I'm also not a scientist, glutens and elastins, proteins. So on a molecular level, we're looking down and we've spotted these individual proteins floating around. If I then add liquid to that ground wheat flour, I add any sort of moisture content to it, right? An interesting thing will happen. I will start to see some movement happening molecularly. And what I'm going to see is that elastin and gluten molecules have started to pair up. So this was a gluten, this was a gluten. These were elastins, another protein that were just floating around. They've sort of magnetized to each other in little clumps once they got wet. They attracted to each other. When I take wet flour and I begin to stir it and add energy and friction to it, I am literally going to take those little elastins that have magnetized up to those glutens and start banging them together. Boom, they're sitting next to each other. Now I'm going to bang them into each other through the force of, let's say, a wooden spoon or a dough hook on your stand mixer, right? Bang, bang, bang. I'm going to bang them around until they boop, bond. And they become one new protein structure. Now that I've created this structure, I've created a dough. I can go through a process called kneading dough, which allows me to make that structure longer and longer and longer. And every time I eke a little bit of length out of that gluten-elastin bond, I create texture in the final baked good. So if I'm going to make a baguette, I am going to knead that dough until I'm sweating. I mean, I want this gluten-elastin bond to be tough because I want that baguette to come out of the oven crispy. I always tell people you need your own teeth to get into a baguette, right? I mean, you got to sink a tooth in there and pull. Texture. If I'm using the same wheat flour and I'm creating something like, let's say, a biscuit, I still want the gluten and elastin to come together. I need that bond to happen, but I want to keep that bond pretty tender. I don't want it to get long and elastic. I want the final bake of that biscuit to be really flaky and light. So when I pull my biscuit out of the oven, I need it to bond. I need it to hold together so I can put the biscuit on the pan and bake it and then pick it up and add ham and bite into it. But when you think about the texture biting into a biscuit, it just sort of falls apart, right? So there's gluten development, but nothing like what we've done with a hardcore kneading. And in biscuit making, we barely touch the dough. We bring it together with liquid buttermilk. We've got some fat worked in there for some puff, crisp, and flavor. But boy, we barely touch it, right? So gluten development is a key component to the texture of our final dough. So if you ask bread bakers why they want gluten in their dough, they're going to tell you texture. 100%, end of story. And for those of us who've tried gluten-free products for whatever reason that may be, we've noticed that the thing that fails every time for us, generally speaking, is the texture. The gluten-free pasta turned to mush every time I tried to make it. The gluten-free crackers, I went to go pull them out to put them on a cheese platter, and they were all just crumbs. They didn't have any texture. They didn't have any elasticity. Without that gluten-elastin bond, they just snap and break, right? So, and if you think about like a corn tortilla, corn does not have any gluten in it. So when you go get a street taco and you do it in a warm corn tortilla, there's always two. It's because the inside one has, even the warm ones, not the crunchy ones, the soft ones, have already torn and broken. So they put a second one around it. But a flour tortilla, right? That's the gluten that gives it that elasticity. So as a bread baker, gluten is important to me not because it's protein. It's important to me because it's a texture creator. That's what develops all the texture. So if I am going to make some bread and I really want to develop a lot of texture, but my wrist is feeling sore, I'm feeling tired, and all of that kneading feels a little too much, one thing I could do is switch gears to a bread flour from an all-purpose flour. The reason is that the bread flour is high gluten flour. It'll be labeled high protein because we've just discussed that gluten is not a carbohydrate, it is a protein. So when I isolate the protein that is gluten and add additional amounts to all-purpose flour, I create bread flour, high protein flour, high gluten flour. Now, in this day and age, in our country, high gluten flour just isn't going to sell. Nobody's going to buy it. We've got this gluten is bad idea, and so they have to sell it as other things. So bread flour is a good way to put it. If I'm feeling a little weak or tired, I might go buy bread flour, and I'll tell you why. The amount of kneading to create that longer and longer gluten elastin textural strand will be considerably less in a product that already has a much higher concentrate of that gluten elastin. So there's one thing to consider. And the more protein that I add to an all-purpose flour, I can start to outweigh a base flour that's most carbohydrates with a little bit of protein. So this flour lands in the simple carbohydrate land. I can start to shift that over to the complex carbohydrate category simply by upping the protein that I add to that flour. And I can take it to a 50-50 point. I can get as much protein in the form of wheat gluten as standard ground wheat, bring those two together and shift this simple carbohydrate into the category of a complex carbohydrate. And when I do that, I can label it as something more healthy seeming, like a keto flour. It's a higher protein flour or a more complex carbohydrate, if you will. If I took a basic cookie dough and started throwing whey protein into it, to the point where I balanced out the amount of flour that is carbohydrate and the amount of sugar and balanced up that carbohydrate protein ratio with whey protein, I could move that chocolate chip cookie from the chocolate chip cookie aisle to the protein bar aisle, right? I've made a complex carbohydrate. And why do athletes look for that? Because it's that long, steady burn of energy. When people come in and tell me that they are off gluten, If someone tells me they have celiacs, we have a long discussion about where we can go with that, what we can work with them here with, how we can make that work for them. If you have celiacs, you can't come to my baguette class because I don't make a gluten-free baguette. It just isn't part of that program. But if you're off gluten, I want to know why. I want to hear from you. What is your reasoning behind it? Because here's the thing that I think tends to happen with the broad range off gluten concept is that in the beginning, we tend to be pretty strict about it. We say, I'm off gluten, and there goes pasta, pizza, drive-through, chips, cookies, right? Well, shoot, I lost 30 pounds in 3 months. Of course we did. So it really wasn't necessarily the gluten, though, was it? There was a lot of processed foods in those categories. There was a lot of fast foods in those categories, and a lot of high-calorie, high-sugar carbohydrates in those categories. That's probably more likely what helped us lose that weight. But as we fade in our stick-to-itiveness on this, we end up having to change gears a little bit. We've got to bring in a little bit of carbohydrate. So what we start buying are gluten-free carbohydrates. And what I mean by that are bags of gluten-free cookies, for example. So in the beginning, we were off cookies, right? We weren't doing those at all. And then we kind of convinced ourselves it wasn't so much about carbs, more about gluten. So then we see a bag of cookies and it's gluten-free cookies. And we go, okay, let's do that. Whoa. Then we start putting on weight, and a different kind of weight, a fluffier weight. For women, a fluffier weight. Why is this happening here? Well, here's one of the theories. When we remove the gluten from carbohydrates like cookies, the thing is that cookie is already a relatively simple carbohydrate, even with the gluten in it, and it's a relatively high sugar carbohydrate. So now we've added sugar and it's a simple carbohydrate. That is a burn fast insulin jacker, right? And then we're going to rip right down in a glucose dump. But at least if we had just bought a cookie made with wheat flour, there would have been some protein in there. The burn would have been mildly slower. A cookie is still not a wonderful source of energy. It's still going to have too much added sugar, and it's still going to burn really quickly. So on the scale, it's going to kind of go in as and go. If it's a gluten-free cookie, no protein whatsoever. You would do so much better if you went with a high gluten cookie. And a high gluten cookie is called a Cliff Bar, a Kind Bar, you name them, a Lara Bar. Those are high gluten cookies. They have a very high sugar content. They have a lot of carbohydrates. And the way that they're slowing the burn so that becomes a healthier option is by jacking the protein. And various ways to jack the protein, extra gluten, which will show up in the form of vital wheat gluten. It might just say wheat flour. But the other way to add it in addition to, there will be a lot more gluten in there. I promise you that. And then another addition will be whey. So whey protein, which is a dairy-based protein. But we move our cookie into Power Bar by adding gluten back into the cookie. So if we take the cookie and buy the gluten-free cookie, we are just eating the simplest high sugar carbohydrate we can possibly find. So to randomly let go of gluten, be careful, because gluten is protein. Protein balances those carbohydrates. If we got in our head that we were going to get rid of carbohydrates, then we let them sneak back in, and we only let ourselves sneak in the gluten-free carbohydrates, we're going to create problems. I can guarantee it. So just some things to think about. I would definitely get with a dietitian and talk macros. I think that's one of the most important things for us to consider is the equal balance of protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And the elimination diets are disappointing. I think we all know that they're not terribly manageable. They're not terribly sustainable. And if you really read the language to any elimination diet, one that tells you to eat 0 carbohydrates, tells you to eat 0 fat, when it eliminates a food group, it will tell you in the language that what it's going to do is trick your body into burning something as fuel that it wouldn't normally. And that isn't sustainable. And they'll tell you in those diets that it's not sustainable. They mean for you to do it for 14-day windows, for 21-day pops, right? It's not meant to be sustainable. So I'm not interested in something that's going to give me a big loss and then a big gain, and then a big loss and then a big gain. I want sustainability. And where can you find that? In your macros. You can find that through balancing. Get those carbohydrates out of the simple category and stack them up with proteins and get them into the complex category. Add the right amount of fat to that and start a steady burn of energy that really is sustainable and does support you. So poor old gluten. I am pro gluten. I look for things that have extra gluten. And by the way, the biggest label behind me right now, as far as the health craze goes, is probably this one. The keto wheat flour. Guess why? Number one ingredient, gluten. There's more isolated gluten in this bag than there is flour. So if we are off gluten, we're off protein. So there it is. Gluten is your friend. We love gluten. I will mention briefly that our gluten-free flours, first of all, almond flour is not flour. It's ground almonds. So if you have made an attempt to make a baguette with this, it has probably failed. These are not cup for cup substitutions. I don't know why my light's going so weirdly. You know what? I think it started raining outside. That's funny. These are not cup for cup substitutions. This is ground nuts, and ground nuts make some interesting doughs and batters and things like that, but they are not just cup for cup exchange for flour. Another one that's out here is, this one is called a gluten-free measure for measure, and that is intended to be a cup for cup. If you're making a cake that called for 3 cups of all-purpose flour, what they're suggesting is you can use 3 cups of this blend in place of. You will get a different result. Without the gluten elastin bond, your texture will be different. So your famous yellow birthday cake with this gluten-free blend will not be the same texture. It will hold up though. Do you know what I mean? It'll make a cake. You will be able to slice it and put icing on it and serve it. Whereas if you just substitute something like ground almonds, that is not going to be the case. This has a lot of gluten-free grains that have been ground up. So rice flour, brown rice flour, sorghum flour, tapioca starch, potato starch, cellulose and xanthan gum. I have news for you. Those aren't, yes, are they safe? Remember the discussion that we had in the other video? Lots of things are safe. I can eat a piece of paper. It's safe. I can chew it up. I can digest it. It doesn't make it good for me. There is a lot of information coming out about the gums, the cellulose and the xanthan gums, about those not supporting good gut health. And creating bloat and things like that. So be careful. My point about this is, if you have celiacs and you want a cake, go for it, baby. Use this 1-to-1 ratio. Your cake is going to be a slightly different texture, but you will have a lovely birthday party and you will support what you need to for your situation. If you are randomly tearing yourself away from gluten and not really sure why, okay, so the protein's out. We've made every carbohydrate we are eating a simple carbohydrate. And now on top of it, we're putting additives in. If I had just made the cake with all-purpose flour, my ingredients would be butter, eggs, salt, sugar, and flour. No gums, no cellulose. So you get where I'm going, guys. Let's be label readers. Think about those processes. And I really just want you to think about why. I say I'm off gluten. Do I know why I'm off gluten? For those of you with celiacs, I do want to share with you that I am sorry that that is something that you're suffering with. I will let you know that, believe it or not, as much as it feels like you're hearing more and more about it, the truth is that the number of people diagnosed with celiacs globally is 1% of the total population globally. And that study was done just in the last couple of years. And the previous time it was done was maybe in the previous 20 years. But there's been a very recent one, and it supported the same numbers, 1%. It is not massively common. Of the autoimmune disorders, it is a common one. But of dietary disorders as a whole, it is still exceptionally uncommon, and it is a huge challenge. But there is more and more information and more stuff to find out there. So I wish you great luck with that, and I am sorry for anyone who's battling that. If you felt like you might be, but you've never been diagnosed, I suggest a diagnosis first and foremost, because if you are, finding that out and finding out how to eliminate gluten from every part of your life is going to be big work, but incredibly beneficial to your overall health. If you are not, you get to let go of so much of that research. And let's get back to the concept of baked goods, breads, carbohydrates, but those complex ones. And our gluten is going to support that we are moving closer to that complex carbohydrate category, more towards it than away from it. And that's what we want for good, sustainable energy. All right, that's my talk. For those of you who are Gumroad subscribers, I just want to say thank you for your support. We are not accepting any more annual memberships for the Gumroad subscription, but you can buy pods and they come with PDF downloads through Gumroad monthly, and they're just under $5. But those who are annual supporters, I just want to say thank you so very much for supporting us for this. And we've got tons of recipes coming at you. I'm giving you our complete 4-week bread series, recipes and handouts, and I'm giving you the complete Bread Baker's Apprentice recipes and handouts. Both of those PDFs come with troubleshooting bread fails at home. The 4-week series has about 3 pages on it. The Apprentice series has about 6 pages on it. We do a deeper dive into those troubleshooting bread fails at home in the Apprentice handout. So I'm very excited for you to have that. If you're not a subscriber and are finding us on YouTube or on my website, thank you so much for being here. Please leave a comment and let us know if you're enjoying the content. And you can find some really lovely bread recipes on my website, achefs.com. We have our baguette recipe, our honey wheat, which is still our most popular bread to this day. And I also have a sourdough starter formula that is free, that's on my website. You can just print it out. Look for blog recipes, which might be where you found this video to begin with. You might be over here already. And there's plenty of baking options for you there as well. Hey, this was a fun series to do. Chris in Nebraska did the Q for the Q&A with Chef A, asked me if I would get talking about flours. Chris, I hope you enjoyed your 2 hours in my mouth through all these videos. That's what you get for asking. But thank you for the interest. And we've got more great videos coming your way soon. I'm due for a cookbook corner, so let's get a few of those in the can. And I hope you guys are having a delicious day. Eat well, bake something wonderful at home for yourself, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.